we see with the pastor, I'm going to start with the pastor specifically, and then we'll move on to the teacher. We see with the pastor that there's a common Greek translation, which is a noun, and then there's a common Hebrew translation, which is going to be throughout your Old Testament. And it's a verb, but both of them have the same literal meaning as far as being translated into English and what their meaning is. And it's a term for literally a shepherd of one who keeps animals. As you see within both the Old and New Testament, there's a lot of talk of shepherds and shepherding various animals, and not just sheep. We see in the New Testament where Jesus primarily, almost solely used sheep as an example, but as far as actual figuratively, we see shepherding of various animals used as an example throughout the Old and New Testament. We also see where the term pastor, it's used for those who are called by God to feed, care for, and lead his people who are his flock. My throat's a little cloggy today, so if I fumble over some stuff, I'm sorry. Several scripture examples of this is in John chapter 20, verse 16. That's, of course, the scripture where you see Peter get his validation reestablished, and Jesus is essentially recommending him to go and be the rock or the leader of the church. Acts 20, verse 28. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 2. A couple Old Testament scriptures here is 1 Kings 22, 17. And Ezekiel chapter 34, verses 2 through 10. Much instruction directed toward such church leaders is found specifically in what's known as the pastoral epistles, which is 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. Apostle Paul wrote all three of those pastoral epistles. And if you go through any sort of pastoral training, leadership classes, anything related to the pastoral ministry, you're going to have a heavy dose of real expository teaching, diving into those three particular books in the New Testament. Reasons for that is those were the letters that the Apostle Paul wrote to Timothy and Titus. As you read through the book of Acts, you see that Timothy and Titus were both apprentices, if you want to call it that, disciples of Paul. They followed Paul. Timothy eventually actually became the church pastor, the pastor there at the church of Ephesus. And we are believed, time-wise, it's been taught that Paul actually wrote this letter to Timothy during his first prison sentence in Rome. Corresponding to the book of Acts, we read in chapter 18 of Acts, where Paul leaves Ephesus to go to Jerusalem. He had been there in Ephesus for 3 years, and Timothy was the fellow he left there to shepherd those people in Ephesus. Paul goes to Jerusalem. He gets in trouble, like they all said he was going to, and he eventually winds up clear over in Rome, over in Italy, doing a prison sentence. And that's when he pins down or has somebody write those two letters, 1st and 2nd Timothy. And it is very, I'll say it's very self-explanatory. Both books are. Paul does an excellent job, and including in Titus, of laying out all the groundwork of what you're going to endure as a pastor, what you're going to endure, what you got to be aware of, specific things that are going to, arise that you're going to have to deal with immediately. He lays out the groundwork as a pastor for appointmentship of deacons and elders for the church in those books. He makes it clear to Timothy that, as things develop, as time goes by, you're going to have people arise within the church that are going to bring in false doctrines, and you're going to have people that are going to follow it. They're going to leave. Let them go. They want to go, let them go. Don't allow it to, get embedded in your own church congregation. And he lays out a lot of character and integrity characteristics that need to be for someone to be appointed as a pastoral figure within a church body. So if you get a chance, as far as for any kind of leadership study, if you really want to dive into just leadership study, pick up a good expository study guide of some sort over those 3 books, and dive into them. There's a lot to learn. Well, preeminently, the ideas applied to and fulfilled in Christ and God Himself. We see this is the pastor, okay? And what I'm meaning by that is we see multiple times where Christ refers to Himself as the true shepherd, the good shepherd. He is the head of the church body. He essentially is our head shepherd, okay? So, one of the preeminent figures we can look at as an example of a faithful, true pastoral calling, someone that really has that appointed calling, is to look at the life of Christ. Read the Gospels and see how Jesus interacted with His disciples, and particularly his interaction with his 12 disciples, apostles. He eventually anointed them apostles. See how He related to them, interacted with them, taught them, rebuked them, etc. Really pay attention to that, and you will have the best imagery example of what a pastor is through Jesus Himself. He was and is our head shepherd above anybody else, period. We get actual scriptural evidence of this, as I said, in the Gospels, but as far as actually Jesus being called or Him calling Himself out as such, we see examples in Matthew chapter 2, verse 6, Mark chapter 14, verse 27, and John chapter 10, verse 11. In the Old Testament, the prophet Isaiah spoke of such in chapter 40, verse 11, and Zechariah makes mention of it in chapter 13, verse 7. In the New Testament, the pastor, shepherd, appears to depict aspects or functions of the responsibilities of the overseer and elder. Scripture citations, 1 Peter 2:25, chapter 2, verse 25. Essentially, why it says overseer, elder, is like I said earlier, okay, is at some point, even with the apostolic ministry being involved within your assembly of believers, the pastor is going to, at some point, take over the majority role of being the overseer of those people. That apostle, and as we see through the book of Acts, is more likely going to be, when I say moving on, I don't mean detaching himself altogether from that assembly, but someone with an apostolic calling, as we see in the book of Acts, they were going from place to place. They weren't at one place all the time. The most time that we are aware of historically that any of the 13 was Paul at Ephesus, which was 3 years. As far as any historical evidence, that's the most time that we are aware of that any one apostle stayed at a specific church body, and it was only 3 years. So at some point, a pastor is going to have to become the main overseer, even head elder, because it's going to be the responsibility of the pastor to pick and appoint his eldership. Okay? The eldership can then gather, pick and appoint their deacons. Okay? All in all, a pastor can obviously, like for here, Larry Morgan is our head elder here, okay? I imagine in a lot of ways, Larry and Pastor Tyner are working very 50-50 in that position, okay? I doubt Larry, and this is not like a lack of trust factor, but Larry's probably not going to go and appoint an elder, suggest an elder or something of that nature without first running it past John and just feeling him out about it. So that's basically your main functions of the pastoral ministry. It's really nothing more than that. We unfortunately have, over time, and it's not just in Western culture, but it's predominantly in Western culture, we've really overloaded the responsibility of the pastor. And a lot of that overloading has came to dump it too much on one man. I fully believe that the more you have, the better, especially as the assembly grows. It's very difficult for one pastor to handle all the responsibilities as an overseer, particularly if he doesn't have an elder or deacon staff that's very involved for whatever the reason that may be. That shows the importance of having a strong elder and deacon staff, as it relieves a lot of that pressure and responsibility from the pastor having to take care of the assembly kind of all by himself. Unfortunately, if you're in a spot where you just, say you have a young church and it grows sporadically, you just have sporadic growth, and you've got a lot of new, fresh, young converts, okay? You're most likely not going to be able just to go picking a bunch of elders and deacons from that group of people. So the most beneficial thing or logical thing to do is to hopefully have more than one person that has a pastoral quality and calling on their life. life, okay? That way one person is not, again, just having to take all the load of responsibility of having to oversee. It's very hard, I feel like, once you get to about 100 people, for one person to really be able to meet the various needs that can come about as far as having to feed, take care of, and lead that group of people. So the more you can have, the better. There's nothing wrong with having multiple pastors on your staff. Past our traditional idea of having a senior pastor, a youth pastor, and maybe a children's church pastor, okay? No, let's expand beyond just that kind of traditionalism. You know, if you have the opportunity to have a couple of pastors on your staff, do it. Absolutely take advantage of it. If you have the opportunity to have 2 or 3 people who feel a youth pastoral calling, get them trained up, plug them in, let them operate in what they are ministerially called for. And just go down the list. Whatever you have the opportunity to have more of, take advantage of it. It's a blessing. Don't, because more than likely what's going to happen if you just push it off to the side is they're going to find somewhere else to go. If for no other reason, they're going to feel too much of an urge to start fulfilling what they've been called to do. And if you're just letting them sit at the bench all the time, eventually they're going to leave